They did not retreat. The Confessions of a Surviving Tanker from the Kursk Bulge. Hey there, friend. How are you doing? I hope you're well. Today, I want to talk to you about a very serious topic. Sometimes I catch myself thinking that we modern people have gotten too used to comfort. We complain about traffic jams, bad weather, or about being unfairly treated by our boss or a cashier at the store. We get upset over a broken nail or a dead phone battery. And in this daily grind, we completely forget the price that was paid for this very peace, for the sky above our heads, and for the simple opportunity to just live. Today, I stumbled upon an old story, or rather, the diary of a German guy named Werner Mayer. He was only 19 years old. Like many of his peers, he ended up in the war. But unlike the propaganda films of that time, his story turned out to be one of revelation, horror, and total collapse of hope. And you know what? Completely blew my mind. I read it several times, then I went online, dug through some historical archives, and realized that this isn't just someone's personal diary. It's the confession of a man who realized that his side lost, not because of a lack of tanks or planes, but because there are things that cannot be defeated with the force of weapons. If you get interested, if you want to understand why the Russians cannot be defeated, and what really happened in the summer of 1943 on the scorched fields near Kursk, Belgorod, and Prokhorovka, stick with me. This post will be long, but I promise you won't regret it. I've put into it not only the dry facts but also my own thoughts, pain, and respect for those who stood their ground. And at the end, as always, I'm waiting for your opinion in the comments. Let's go. The beginning of the journey, pride and illusion. Imagine an ordinary field. Wheat is earing, the sun is shining, the wind is rustling the grass. An idyll, right? Now imagine that in a month, this field will turn into a branch of hell. Not a single blade of grass will remain. The earth will be mixed with metal and clotted blood, and the air will become so thick with soot that it will be impossible to breathe. June 1943. A young German guy, Werner, gets assigned to the elite 505th Heavy Tank Battalion. He writes in his diary that his hands are shaking, but not from fear, from pride. He was entrusted with a Tiger. Can you imagine? 57 tons of steel, a powerful cannon, armor that they were told was impenetrable. The company commander, patting him on the shoulder, proclaims that with such equipment, they'll reach the Urals. And Werner believes it. He's young, full of strength, and he doesn't yet know that equipment is far from the most important thing in war. But there was a fly in the ointment. An old, scarred tanker named Mahler, looking at the newcomer, said a phrase that Werner would remember for the rest of his life. The Russians haven't read our tactical manuals. They have their own kind of war. The guy didn't understand the meaning then. How could they not have read them? There are rules of combat strategies. But Mahler, who had been through fire and smoke, already knew what Werner would only come to understand through his own mind and blood. Then comes July 4th. The air is electric. Operation Citadel is being prepared. It was supposed to be the triumph of German military thought. The newest Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinands lined up. The generals were convinced that the Russians wouldn't withstand such an onslaught, that their defenses would crumble in a couple of days. But why then were the veterans frowning and silent? Why did that same Muller take out his family photo every evening and look at it as if saying goodbye? Hell begins. A revelation in one day. July 5th, 1943. What happened that morning, Werner would never forget. In the pre-dawn silence, a thunderclap erupted so loudly that the earth seemed to rear up. But it wasn't their artillery preparation. It was an avalanche of return fire. Soviet intelligence had worked flawlessly. Our side knew not only the date but also the hour of the offensive. And they met the enemy fully armed. Werner writes that the sky turned black with planes. But those weren't just Luftwaffe planes. Our aviators weren't sitting idle either. The meat grinder had begun. When their battalion moved forward, it turned out that every meter of ground was zeroed in. Every gun was camouflaged, and the new Russian T-34 tanks popped out of cover like devils from a snuff box. Remember Muller's phrase about manuals? That's when it took on flesh and blood. The Russians didn't form pretty linear battle orders. They fought for every inch of land, using tactics that couldn't be calculated in general staffs. By evening, out of 5 tanks in the platoon, only 2 were left. Werner saw, for the first time, tanks burning. First, just a dull thud, then an orange flash, and a second later, multi-ton machines turned into blazing torches with people screaming inside. The smell of burnt flesh and scorched metal seeps into your skin so that nothing can wash it off. July 12th, Prokhorovka. Dante takes a back seat. Then it gets worse. July 12th, Prokhorovka. I've read many books, watched movies, but when you see the numbers and eyewitness accounts, you realize that Dante, describing the circles of hell, was just warming up. Imagine. The sky disappeared completely. It was blocked out by thick, black smoke from hundreds of burning machines. The sun was invisible. The air was so hot that armor was melting. A continuous roar, clang, and rumble filled the air. Shots, explosions, screams, all merging into one monstrous symphony of destruction. On that day, 2 armadas clashed. On one side, the elite SS Panzer divisions equipped with Tigers. On the other, General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards tank army. And then something happened that the Germans never expected. They thought the Tiger would pick them off from a distance. But our tank crews closed the distance. They went for the ram, straight at the enemy's guns. They understood that in close combat, their gun was almost as powerful, and their maneuverability was better. It was a slaughter where survival depended not on who had thicker armor, but on who had stronger nerves and more hatred for the enemy. Werner describes how a Soviet tanker, engulfed in flames, jumped out of his burning tank and ran straight at their Tiger with grenades. Not to hide, not to fall, not to retreat, but to run towards certain death, to take the enemy with him. At that moment, I'm sure something clicked in Werner's head. He understood that they were fighting for the Führer, for an idea, for Lebensraum. But these Russian guys were fighting for their home, for their mother, for their bride, for the birch tree outside their window. And this difference cannot be covered by any armor. Agony and realization, why spirit matters more than steel. After the battle, Werner writes lines that, for me as a modern person, send chills down my spine. He says that the Russian soldier is ready to die, but not to retreat. And that wasn't just a figure of speech. German historians, analyzing the Battle of Kursk, later admitted, the German troops were exhausted. They hadn't expected such fierce resistance. The Citadel plan failed precisely because of the courage of the Soviet soldiers who stood to the death. Look at the numbers. By the summer of '43, our fronts numbered about 1.9 million men, thousands of tanks and guns. But numbers are just numbers. Behind them lies this. When a German officer looked through his periscope and saw the approaching T-34s heading for a ram, he realized they wouldn't win this war. Because you cannot conquer a country where every soldier is ready to burn himself along with you in the same fire. Here's another fact. Researchers say that German tank losses near Prokhorovka were relatively small compared to ours. Some historians claim that the SS division Leibstandard lost only about 20 vehicles, while our corps lost hundreds. So what? And that changes nothing. The main result was that the Germans didn't break through. They got bogged down, exhausted, and stopped. They lost the battle for strategic initiative. Yes, they knocked out many of our tanks, yes, they inflicted huge losses, but they did not accomplish their mission. Kursk remained ours. And after July 12th, the Red Army drove them back, liberating Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkov. Afterward, what remains beyond the lines? Werner's fate was then sealed. A shell fragment pierced the armor, and he ended up in the hospital. And when our forces went on the offensive, the Germans rolled back. Werner tried to evacuate but didn't make it. His diary was found in a knocked-out tank. His last lines aren't a cry for help. They're an attempt to understand why everything went wrong. And here I want to pause. You often hear, why should we remember that war? It was so long ago. Because, my friends, the lessons of the Kursk Bulge are still relevant today. History repeats itself. Again and again, there are those who think their tigers are invincible, who think they can come to someone else's land with iron and fire and it will all work out. And again, they crash against that same Russian character, that same readiness to die for one's land. Why did our grandfathers win? because they had a goal that was higher than the fear of death. They were defending their home. The Germans were professionals. They had excellent training, the best equipment, superb logistics. But they were invaders. And a war of invasion is always a losing war, no matter how strong you are. I often think, could I do that? Could I, like that unknown tanker, jump out of a burning machine and run at the enemy, knowing it's the end? Honestly, I don't know. But I do know one thing for sure. The memory of their feat must live on. Not in the form of dry textbook paragraphs, but in stories like this one that get under your skin. So that every time life seems unfair to us, we remember that heat, that steel, and that will that saved our world. Conclusion and call to action. Friends, I spent a lot of time putting this story together for you. I dug through tons of sources, from serious historical archives to eyewitness accounts from both sides. And every time I read these lines, I feel something that's hard to put into words. It's a mix of pride, pain, horror, and endless gratitude. If this story resonated with you, if something inside you stirred, if you feel that we must not forget such things, please subscribe to this channel. Here, I try to share not just dry facts, but living stories that make you think and feel. Your opinion matters to me. Write in the comments. What do you feel when you read diaries like this? Are there any stories related to the war in your own family? Do you think people have changed? Do we value life as much as those who survived the meat grinder of 1943? Let's talk about it. Don't walk by. One comment, one subscription. It's a small tribute to those who gave us life. Let's not be indifferent. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And remember, as long as we remember, they live on.